During my speech at the NYC Can March, I mentioned Philip Zelikow. However, I barely touched the surface on the subject, so what I'm going to do is read number Fact 16 from my article entitled The Facts Speak for Themselves. Philip Zelikow was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. Paul Sperry explained, quote, "Though he has no vote, Zelikow arguably has more sway than any member, including the chairman. Zelikow picks the areas of investigation, the briefing materials, the topics for hearings, the witnesses, and the lines of questioning for witnesses. In effect, he sets the agenda and runs the investigation." End quote. In 1995, Zelikow wrote a book with Condoleezza Rice called Germany Unified and Europe Transformed, A Study in Statecraft. While at Harvard, quote, he worked with Ernest May and Richard Neustadt on the use and misuse of history in policy making. They observed, as Zelikow noted in his own words, that, quote, contemporary history is defined functionally by those critical people and events that go into forming the public's presumptions about its immediate past. The idea of public presumption, he explained, is akin to William McNeill's notion of public myth, but without the negative implication sometimes invoked by the word myth. Such presumptions are beliefs, one, thought to be true although not necessarily known to be true with certainty, and two, shared in common with the relevant political community. End quote. Between 1997 and 1998, Zelikow helped to write a report that said, quote, long part of the Hollywood and Tom Clancy repertory of nightmarish scenarios, catastrophic terrorism has moved from far-fetched horror to a contingency that could happen next month. Although the United States still takes conventional terrorism seriously, it is not yet prepared for the new threat of catastrophic terrorism, end quote. They predict the consequences of such an event, quote, an act of catastrophic terrorism that killed thousands or tens of thousands of people and or disrupted the necessities of life for hundreds of thousands or even millions, would be a watershed event in America's history. It could involve loss of life and property unprecedented for peacetime and undermine Americans' fundamental sense of security within their own borders in a manner akin to the 1949 Soviet atomic bomb test, or perhaps even worse. Constitutional liberties would be challenged as the United States sought to protect itself from further attacks by pressing against allowable limits in surveillance of citizens, detention of suspects, and the use of deadly force. More violence would follow, either as other terrorists seek to imitate this great success, or as the United States strikes out at those considered responsible. Like Pearl Harbor, such an event would divide our past and future into a before and after. End quote. In 1997, Zelikow and Ernest May wrote a report about John F. Kennedy that is, quote, riddled with errors. Zelikow wrote a preemptive war strategy for the Bush administration. Zelikow said that the real threat with regards to Iraq's WMD was to Israel. Zelikow tried to prevent the 9/11 Commission staffers from talking to the commissioners. Zelikow tried to insert a false connection between Iraq and 9/11 into the 9/11 report, but the families and the staffers fought against it. It has been alleged that he may have taken direction from Karl Rove, who, according to Philip Sheenan, was concerned about the 9/11 Commission because, quote, in the wrong hands, it could cost President Bush a second term, end quote. The allegation regarding Rove drove the September 11th advocates, formerly known as the Jersey Girls, to call for an entirely new investigation. Only Raw Story covered that story. In early 2003, Philip Zelikow and Ernest May wrote a complete outline of the final 9/11 report. Zelikow, Keene, and Hamilton decided to keep this outline a secret from the commission staffers. when, quote, it was later disclosed that Zelikow had prepared a detailed outline of the Commission's final report at the very start of the investigation, many of the staff's investigators were alarmed, end quote. He rewrote the 9/11 report to be more favorable of Condoleezza Rice. During the time of the 9/11 Commission, the families called for the resignation of Philip Zelikow, but were denied that request. After the 9/11 Commission was finished, Philip Zelikow was given a job with Condoleezza Rice at the State Department. That's the end of Fact 16. Now, if you have any doubt as to whether or not Philip Zelikow was a Bush administration lackey, think about the fact that he tried to insert a false connection between Iraq and 9/11 into the 9/11 report. Who would that have benefited?